Hello, my name is Neal Pease. I'm a professor of history at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and this is the second in a series of lectures on various subjects in the history of Poland that I have been invited to give by the Polish Center of Wisconsin, located in Franklin, Wisconsin. And the subject I want to talk about today, as you can see in the sort of forbiddingly long title at the top right corner of the slide, is Danzig, Gdańsk, Lvov, Lviv, what the parallel histories of two cities can tell us about 20th century Polish history. Now, before I go any further, let me just mention, it might not be necessary, but any views that I present in this presentation are not those of the Polish Center of Wisconsin, nor of my university. They are mine and mine alone. Now, Gdańsk, Danzig, Lviv, Lvov, uh, what are the histories of these two cities, and what can they tell us about 20th century Polish history? Well, to a certain extent, this comes out of a subject that I tried to emphasize in the first lecture that I presented in this series, which is that the Poland of today, the Poland of the Third Polish Republic, represented in the map that you see on the left-hand side of this slide. Historically, it is very unusual. It is somewhat smaller and considerably to the west of the Poland of history, which, when it existed as a state, you'll recall that the independence of Poland has been a sometime thing over the years, particularly between 1795 and 1918, when what had been the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had been partitioned and placed under foreign rule by its three neighbors. But the Poland of history, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, was much larger, and most of its landmass lay considerably to the east of the Poland of today. And you can see that represent the shifting boundaries of Poland. You can see represented in the map on the right here that is in Polish, and you can just sort of make out the boundaries of contemporary Poland considerably to the west of the areas of, well, it's in Polish here, but Lithuania, Belarus, and Ukraine, that for centuries made up the greater part of the territory of Poland. And it occurred to me that in many ways, much of the turbulent and eventful history of 20th century Poland, indeed of Europe and the world, can be told in the comparative histories of two cities and the relationship of those two cities during the 20th century. And those are the cities that now are known as Gdańsk, a city in Poland on the Baltic Sea coast, and what is now known as Lviv in Ukrainian, the largest city of the western part of independent Ukraine, but for many centuries was known in Polish as Lvov, and one of the largest and most important cities of Poland. And the interesting thing about this is that Lviv, formerly Lvov, is not in Poland now and has not been, effectively speaking, since the outbreak of the Second World War, nearly a century ago. And Gdańsk, now in Poland, in many ways was not a Polish city until it became part of contemporary Poland after the Second World War. Now, let me go on a little bit and start talking about these two cities. The city to the east that you see here indicated in its Latin name of Leopolis. It has been known by many other names throughout the centuries. Lvov in Russian, Lemberg in German and in Yiddish, Lviv in Ukrainian, and Lvov in Polish. Both Leopolis and Lvov indicate the meaning of the city as the city of the lions. And Lvov, now Lviv, is a city now of about 750,000. In the days before World War II, this shows one of the central squares of what was then Polish Lvov before World War II. Lvov was not the capital of Poland, but it was in many ways, it's probably safe to say, one of the most picturesque and perhaps the most beloved of Polish cities. It was a city with its own folklore, a city with its own dialect in Polish. And now Lvov is no longer a part of Poland. It has not been since the Second World War. It is the principal city of the western part of what is now independent Ukraine. And you see here scenes from the Lviv of today. It's a very interesting place. It is, to be honest, one of my favorite cities to visit. The old town of Lviv is picturesque and charming. One of the hidden treasures of Europe. Very much indicating its heritage, mixed heritage of Polish and Austro-Hungarian influence. You see here some scenes from the old historic districts of Lviv, formerly Lvov, which contrast markedly with the remainder of the city, which is sort of drab and dreary and ramshackle, very much a consequence of its captivity within the Soviet Union from World War II until the fall of the Soviet Union at the end of the Cold War, end of the 1980s, and the beginning of the 1990s. Now, the other city I want to talk about is this one, represented in the maps and the woodcuts from earlier years. And you see it identified not by its current Polish name of Gdansk, but by its traditional Germanic name of Danzig. And this indicates the sort of dual character of the city throughout the centuries up until the 20th century. It was historically one of the principal cities of Poland, but it was not really Polish in its architecture or its population or its culture. It was primarily a German-speaking city. In many ways, both Lvov, now Lviv, and Danzig, now Gdansk, exemplify something that was not at all uncommon through the history of the eastern part of Europe, that being that cities tended to have populations and cultures that differed from the hinterlands in which they were occupied. For instance, Lvov. I've sort of gotten ahead of the story, but Lvov was before World War II primarily a Polish-speaking city and Polish settled city. The population of Lvov was about 50% ethnically Polish, about 30% East European Jewish. with the remainder being Ukrainian speakers. Now, this contrasted markedly with the population of the territories surrounding the city, which were primarily Ukrainian speaking, with the Polish speakers and the non-Ukrainian speakers sort of huddled in the cities of that region. The opposite was the case in the areas around Danzig or Gdansk. Danzig itself was primarily a German city, a German-speaking city, located within the Kingdom of Poland and a Polish-speaking countryside. Now, how did this work? Well, Danzig, in a sense, to say that old Danzig was German is not quite accurate. It was more Hanseatic, if you will. Now, what do I mean by Hanseatic? Well, Danzig, as you can possibly see from the map here on the left-hand part of the slide, Danzig was one of a series of port cities, maritime trading cities located in the coastlines of the North Sea and the Baltic Sea. You can see Danzig here, but you also see, to the northeast of Danzig, Riga, which is now in Latvia. To the west of Danzig, you see Rostock, Lübeck, Hamburg, Bruges. Cities like that, now located in what is now Germany or the Low Countries. Now, what was the characteristic of these cities? Well, they were maritime cities, and their economy and livelihoods were dominated uh, by merchants who handled maritime trade. And by and large, these were German-speaking merchants. And that was the case in Danzig and as well as the other cities of the Hanseatic. And the importance of Danzig lay in this. It was the principal port city of the old Commonwealth of Poland-Lithuania. It lay at the mouth of the Vistula River. And in those days, Poland-Lithuania was the breadbasket of Europe, and it grew grain that would be harvested and then floated on barges up the Vistula, where it would be unloaded in Danzig. And from Danzig, it would be sold by the merchants of Danzig to various consumers elsewhere in Europe. And it was Danzig's status as the main grain port of Eastern Europe that provided the prosperity of the city and indeed the prosperity of the Commonwealth of Poland-Lithuania, of which it was the main port. Now, again, notwithstanding, Danzig was not really a Polish city in its culture or its architecture or the like. If you look at the historic areas of Danzig today, they don't look much like the cities of the Polish interior, like Krakow or Warsaw or Lviv, now Lviv for that matter. In many ways, Danzig didn't resemble the main cities of the interior of Germany either. It was again Hanseatic. In many ways, it resembled more like Copenhagen or a city in Scandinavia or the like. It was that sort of cosmopolitan culture of the Hanseatic League. But now Danzig is a city of about 500,000, and it is the main historic area of a conurbation of three cities: Danzig, Gdynia, and Sopot, I should now say Gdańsk, not Danzig, Gdańsk, Gdynia, and Sopot, that collectively are known as the Tri-City, and have a combined population of about 1 million, and it's really located there on the seacoast of the Baltic Sea, one of the most fetching areas of Poland. Just to take an example close to home, about 10 years ago, our youngest son, who had never been to Poland before, he went off to Poland to spend the summer studying at the university, the Jagiellonian University in Krakow, and he came home, and he saw most of the cities of Poland, contemporary Poland, and Gdańsk was the one that struck him as the most pleasant to visit, simply as a tourist. But now let's move on with the story. Gdańsk, well, Danzig, served as one of the chief cities, sometimes the largest city, and the main port city, and in many ways the most important city of the Commonwealth of Poland-Lithuania for many centuries. And Lviv, to the east, was one of the main cities of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. But as many of you know, I don't have to tell you, in the late 18th century, the Commonwealth of Poland-Lithuania was divided up by its three neighbors, the lands and peoples of what had been Poland-Lithuania, placed under tripartite rule by the German, Austrian, and Russian empires. And the two cities that we are talking about today, Danzig, became part of Germany for the next 125 years, and Lviv, or Lemberg, as it became known in German, became part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, again, until the end of World War I and the collapse of the three empires. Now, that was the status of things until the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, a very complicated event, and most of you probably know that World War I ended up, it was the greatest war in the history of Europe up until that point. Of course, a much larger and more destructive war would follow just a generation later. And one of the consequences of World War I, the victory of the Allies over the Central Powers, was the collapse of the three empires, Russia, Germany, Austria, Hungary, that had dominated the eastern zone of Europe for more than a century, and its replacement by a belt of newly independent countries, including for the first time in a century and a quarter, the return of an independent Poland known as the Second Polish Republic. Now, the return of Poland to the map of Europe was difficult and troubled. One reason, as many of you will know, was that the new Poland had to be put back together out of fragments from what had been various other countries over the course of the 19th century. Russia, Germany, Austria, other countries, new countries that thought they had a valid claim to lands that the new Poland thought was rightfully theirs, like Lithuania, and although it's not shown here, a Ukrainian independence movement. This meant the reconstruction of Poland was bound to be messy and complicated, and ultimately became violent, and required settlement not simply by treaty, but by force of arms in various locations. Another point was that the populations of what would become the new Poland were ethnically mixed. You see here to the right a linguistic map of what became the Second Polish Republic as of the 1930s. And one thing that you might be able to tell from this is that, well, no, you can't really tell it, but just trust me when I say that the pink or light red that you see here indicates areas where ethnic Poles clearly predominated and held a majority. And you can see that that was only true for part of the country. And about two-thirds of the population of the Second Polish Republic was ethnically Polish. And for our purposes, it is possibly worthwhile to point out that if you take a look at the southeastern part of what became the Second Polish Republic, largely yellow, and that is the area that was generally known as East Galicia. It is now the western part of independent Ukraine, but it became part of the Second Polish Republic. And if you can tell, you can see that this shows the city of Lviv, and that it was kind of a dot of pink set in the midst of a largely yellow or Ukrainian speaking countryside. Now, furthermore, up here in the north, you see this solid blue area around the city of, well, it's shown here as Gdansk, but it was primarily still known as by its German name of Danzig. And the fact that the area in and around Gdansk is entirely blue indicates that it was almost entirely a German-speaking area. As a matter of fact, the population of the city, Danzig or Gdansk, in those days was about 98% German speaking. Now, what happened? Well, how were the fates of these two cities settled? In the case of Lviv, it was by force of arms. The post-war treaties did not govern what happened in the eastern zone of Europe, where the victorious Allies had no control. And what you had in East Galicia was conflicting claims of the new state of Poland and partisans of Ukrainian patriots who wanted to establish an independent West Ukrainian state. Now, what were the arguments of these two sides? Well, from the standpoint of the Poles, this was an area that historically had been Polish. It also included cities such as Lviv, which were which were citadels of Polish culture, and it was inconceivable to Polish patriots that you could have a Poland that did not include Lviv. On the other hand, you had the claims of Ukrainians who thought of the Poles as their persecutors over history, that Ukrainians in fact formed the majority of the population of East Galicia, and that it was time to throw off Polish rule, and that Lviv, or Lviv as they called it, was the natural capital of the West Ukraine that they wanted to settle. Well, this was decided by force of arms, by a war between forces of Poland and Ukraine in 1918 and 1919. This included uh, pogroms carried out against the Jewish population of the city by rogue soldiers and civilians on both sides, Polish and Ukrainian, um, but ended in the victory of the Polish side and the defense of Lvov, um, shown by the Polish patriotic painting in the upper right-hand corner, became part of modern uh, Polish patriotic lore. And although it is obscured, unfortunately, uh, by my own visage there, uh, Poland established a memorial uh, to, to those who had given their lives for the Polish cause in retaining the beloved city of Lvov in a memorial established in the Wyczakowski Cemetery, one of the largest cemeteries in Europe, sometimes called the Père Lachaise of the east of Europe, a park-like cemetery similar to Père Lachaise in many ways in Paris, the final resting place of many Polish notables, um, as well as Ukrainians, including Ivan Franko, the father of the modern Ukrainian language. And this memorial to the Polish heroes of the War of 1918, 1919, became one of the fondest uh, memorials to mementos of the struggle to reestablish Polish independence and to reincorporate the city of Lvov into Poland. Now, the story in Danzig or Gdansk was different and, in a sense, more peaceful, but no less controversial. What happened, of course, was one of one of the questions that had to be settled after the First World War was the division of territories between defeated Germany and how much of the territory of Germany was going to be given to the newly recreated Poland. And you see here a map that shows the uh, the division of territory here, and these are the areas. Let's see if I can. Okay, here we go. These are the areas, as you see, that had been part of Germany since the partitions of Poland in the 18th century, but were now, I should actually jog it around there, but were now given to the new Poland. And these were areas that were primarily, it's fair to say, primarily Polish in their populations. Um, Although their loss was keenly resented by Germany, and I think it's fairly easy to understand how German patriots would resent uh, these losses of territories that for generations they had thought of as rightfully German. But then there was the question of what to do about Danzig, because you see, it was axiomatic among the Allies that the new Poland had to have secure access to the sea. If Poland was going to be a viable state, then what it would have to do would be it would have to be able to carry out international commerce by means of its only navigable river, the Vistula. as it had done for centuries back in the days of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Uh, Now, the problem with this was that the Vistula traversed territories that were indisputably Polish, but then as you got closer to the mouth of the Vistula, it went through territories that were Polish inhabited, but had been part of Germany for over a century, and as I've already said, whose loss was resented by Germany. But then, where was the mouth of the Vistula River? Where did it empty out? Well, it emptied out in the city of Danzig, which was historically Polish, but which was, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, 98% German speaking. Now, what were you going to do about this? Were you going to give Danzig to Germany, which would have made sense in an ethnic sense? That would simply have been incontestable. Would you give it to Poland on the grounds that Danzig had historically been a Polish city and that Danzig was the only port that you could give to Poland that would guarantee Polish access to the sea? Well, the peacemakers decided to compromise. They gave Danzig neither to Poland nor to Germany, but made of Danzig a free city, that would govern itself, meaning that the population of Danzig, almost entirely German, could govern itself. However, Poland would be given the right to use Danzig as a port and as a military garrison. As you might well imagine, this was a solution that really fully satisfied neither party. It didn't fulfill what Poland wanted. Poland wanted to be given Danzig outright and make it a Polish Gdansk, and Germany wanted Danzig to remain German. But this compromise solution, it is safe to say, was less satisfactory to the German side than it was to the Polish side. And what it did was to make the question of Danzig a sort of sore point in Europe for a generation, and the cause of the return of Danzig to Germany became a rallying point for German nationalists for 20 years to come. And just as importantly, it became for Poland a matter of importance that the status of Danzig could not be challenged. That any attempt to restore Danzig to Germany would be resisted by force if necessary. And of course, what you had for the next 20 years in the 1920s and the 1930s was an extraordinarily disordered era of history. The period of the independent Second Polish Republic was neither really stable or secure, and in the end turned out to be Europe of those years turned out to be a sort of breeding ground for catastrophe yet to come. For one thing, it became the idea had been that after World War I, Europe would be recreated as a zone of democracies, and that proved false. As a matter of fact, the momentum was swinging towards dictatorship. Even the Polish Republic swung to something like a dictatorship as you moved into the later 1920s and the 1930s. But it was hardly the worst or the most dangerous dictatorship to emerge in Europe in those years. Uh, these were the decades of the rise of Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, represented here by the men uh, who would dominate those tyrannies by the time Europe entered the 1930s. Adolf Hitler in Germany and Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union, the two greatest, if that's the word to use, mass murderers in the history of Europe. And in a sense, both of them would play key roles and, at least initially, would collaborate in the outbreak of the Second World War, which, as I don't have to tell most of the people who would be listening today, began with a joint attack by both of them on the Second Polish Republic. You see here a map of Europe. It's in French, but you can probably make it out. It's a map of Europe as it stood in a political sense on the eve of the outbreak of the Second World War on the 1st of September of 1939. And what you will see there is Nazi Germany, represented in brown, an alliance of countries that had pledged, at least on paper, to protect Poland against what clearly was an imminent planned German attack. You have Poland and its two allies to the west, the United Kingdom and France. Now, the large red blob that you see in the east represents the main neutral country in this, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And at this time, both alliances were trying to gain at least the benevolent neutrality of the Soviet Union in the controversy of the day. Now, the anti-German alliance, Poland, France, and the United Kingdom, perhaps complacently believed that they could count on the Soviet Union to favor them, or at least not to favor Germany. For one thing, because the Soviet Union had loudly proclaimed over the preceding years that they despised German Nazism and that the Soviet Union was the greatest champion of anti-Nazism in the world. Now, ultimately, the Soviet Union would do the lion's share of destroying the German war machine during the Second World War. But in fact, what happened in the run up to the outbreak of war in 1939 was a deal between between these heretofore enormous rivals, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. The Nazi-Soviet Pact, a non-aggression pact between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, that shocked and surprised the world. On its face, the Nazi-Soviet Pact pledged that neither country would go to war against the other. A clear indication that Stalin was giving Hitler free rein to launch a war against Poland without fear of Soviet interference. In fact, the Nazi-Soviet Pact went much deeper. It included a secret agreement between the two countries that was not revealed until after the German documents were captured at the end of World War II, a secret agreement between Hitler and Stalin that in fact they would divide the territories of Eastern Europe between them, basically draw a line running north and south down the map of Europe, and anything to the east of that line running through the heart of Poland was dibs Soviet. Anything to the west, dibs Nazi Germany. And you see here the actual map they used and the line that they drew, assigning these areas to the Soviet Union. And those were areas that included the city of Lviv down here. And anything to the west would, of course, go to Nazi Germany. Now, the war broke out with a German attack on Poland on September the 1st, 1939, and that was followed on September 17th by an attack, by a surprise attack of the Soviet Red Army against the undefended boundary of Poland on the Soviet frontier. Polish forces at this point being entirely engaged in the losing struggle to try to hold off the Nazis. The Second World War began with a German attack in Danzig, the contested city of Danzig, and the environs of Danzig. A German ship, the Schleswig-Holstein, initiated hostilities by beginning shelling of the Polish military garrison on the nearby peninsula called Westerplatte on September the 1st, and the Polish garrison of about 180 soldiers held out bravely, but impossibly, for 7 days before capitulating. And the Battle of Westerplatte has gone down in Polish lore as the first example of Polish heroic resistance to the German invasion of World War II. And after World War II, a monument was erected at Westerplatte as a sort of tribute to Polish heroism and patriotism during World War II. Now, that was what was the situation of the Polish lands in the first 2 years of the war, 1939 and 1941? Well, they were divided. This was a period in which, for the most part, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, the countries that had jointly invaded Poland, also jointly ruled the Polish territories. Poland, although it was overwhelmed by the Germans and the Soviets, did not surrender and went on. The Polish government went into exile and continued to wage war on the Allied side until the very end of the war in 1945. And you see here a Polish poster from those days, Poland first to fight, indicating that it was Poland that first took up arms against Nazi Germany from the very first day of World War II. Now, during this period, the Polish lands suffered grievously. About 6 to 7 million inhabitants of what had been the Second Polish Republic died during World War II. Roughly 2 million ethnic Poles, 1 million Ukrainian and Belarusian, 3 million East European Jews, the largest Jewry in Europe. Of course, the Holocaust was largely carried out on the lands of occupied Poland. It was this horrific experience that led the American historian Timothy Snyder famously to call this zone of Eastern Europe the Bloodlands. The regions roughly corresponding to the old Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth of history that uh, had in which tens of millions of people died as a result of bloodletting unleashed by the German and Soviet dictatorships. Now, during this first period of the war, the lands of Poland were divided between a German zone in the west and a Soviet zone in the east. Uh, During this time, Danzig, remember we are talking about the two cities, Danzig became reincorporated into Germany, and the city that the Poles called Lvov became Lvov in the Soviet Union. Um, During these years, the Soviet rule over what had been Eastern Poland, the regions including Lvov, uh, was hardly less cruel than that of the German tyranny in the Western zone, uh, unless of course one was Jewish, in which case you were far better off in the Soviet zone. But for Gentiles, particularly Poles and Ukrainians, the lot of that they had under Soviet rule was enormously difficult. Over 1 million Poles and other peoples were forcibly deported by the new Soviet authority eastward into Siberia, from which many would never return. And of course, infamously, there was the question of what the Soviets would do with the tens of thousands of Polish soldiers who had been taken prisoners of war by the Soviets during the military campaign of 1939. And by 1940, the decision was undertaken by Stalin and his henchman, the leader of the Soviet secret police, Lavrentiy Beria, uh, to execute these Polish captives primarily by gunshot, and to murder them secretly. And you see here, as a matter of fact, the very order with Stalin's signature authorizing the liquidation of these over 20,000 Polish prisoners who became the victims of what would become known to history as the Katyn massacres. Now, things changed in the summer of 1941. Nazi Germany betrayed its working partnership with the Soviet Union. Uh, the whole point of the war, as far as Hitler and the Nazis was concerned, was to conquer all of Eastern Europe, including not simply Poland, but also the Western territories of the Soviet Union, and to recreate these as a gigantic German-dominated empire that they would incorporate uh, into Germany, that they would colonize with Germans, they would expel or murder or reduce the remaining non-German population to slave status. Consequently, Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June of 1941, and took over immediately the areas of what had been um, Soviet occupied eastern Poland, or what, including the areas around the city of Lvov. Uh, the beautiful city of Lvov entered an even more hellish state in the latter years of the war than had been the case in uh, the initial stage. Uh, this was kicked off by uh, the Soviet forces when they evacuated Lvov ahead of the German invasion, massacred uh, the prisoners they had held in the prisons of the city. You see here a picture of the corpses of these Polish prisoners, mourned by their friends and relatives, and of course the advent of the German power in what had been Eastern Poland uh, began and ultimately concluded the extermination of the large Jewish population of Eastern Poland and Lvov, with the carrying out of the Holocaust in that area. Now, ultimately, of course, Nazi Germany would not win the war. One of the consequences of the German invasion of the Soviet Union was the creation of the alliance of the United Kingdom, the United States, and the Soviet Union that would join forces and defeat Nazi Germany, which it did by 1945. However, this would take a while. It would take over 3 years, and it also involved a fateful division of labor. That being that the alliance adopted a military strategy whereby the Western Allies, uh, the United Kingdom, the United States, would invade Nazi Germany from the west, going eastward, liberating France and the Low Countries and Italy in the process. The Soviet Red Army, and solely the Soviet Red Army, would invade Nazi Germany from the east, moving westward, meaning that only the Soviet Red Army would liberate, and in the end, as it turned out, also conquer Poland and the other countries of Eastern and Central Europe that had been under German occupation for the balance of World War II. This would have consequences. Another thing that was happening during World War II was that there were various vicious sideshows going on. And one of these was happening in the areas of what had been southeastern Poland, East Galicia, the areas around the city of Lvov. And again, as before, these were areas that Poles thought of as historically and rightfully Polish, but that various Ukrainian forces thought of as rightfully Ukrainian. And one thing that happened during World War II was the rise of a right wing Ukrainian partisan force called the uh, Ukrainian Resistance Army, or the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, that carried out, under cover of the war, a vicious campaign of murder and ethnic cleansing against Polish residents in East Galicia. The idea being that if there was to be an independent Ukraine after World War II, that this would have to be a Ukraine that had been, to use the phrase that was not known then, but we use now, ethnically cleansed. It would have to be, the Poles of this area, the Polish minority, would have to be either driven out or murdered, and the area made entirely ethnically Ukrainian. Between 1943 and 1945, uh, anywhere from 50 to 100,000 Poles in this area. Voin, the Volhynia or Voin massacres. Between 43 and 44, 45, between 50 to 100,000 Poles uh, died. Also, uh, perhaps as many as 15 to 20,000 Ukrainians were killed, either as a result of reprisals by the Polish Underground Army, the Home Army, the Armia Krajowa, or Ukrainians killed by the UPA, the Ukrainian right-wing forces against Ukrainians whom they considered to be insufficiently anti-Polish or traitors to the Ukrainian cause. This would complicate the decisions regarding the fate of what had been southeastern Poland, and what could be done to still the bloodletting and ethnic warfare that was now taking place there. Of course, in the end, what happened after World War II and after the victory of the Allies over Nazi Germany and its allies was the recreation of East Central Europe as a block of nominally independent countries, but in fact only semi-independent, because they had been recreated as essentially puppet states within a zone of Soviet influence, governed by communists who were beholden to the Soviet Union. And this included the new version of Poland that became known as the Polish People's Republic, as it would exist between 1944-45 and the end of the PRL, with the end of the Cold War in 1989. Now, one thing that happened as a result of this reorganization, this post-war reorganization of Eastern Europe, was a massive redrawing of the boundaries of Poland. The Soviet, to shorten a very complicated story, the Soviet Union was largely able to determine the peace settlement in Eastern Europe, and the Soviet Union insisted on retaining the territories of what had been Eastern Poland that had been granted to them initially by Hitler in 1939. The compromise solution, if you want to call it that, that the Allies came up with and that the British and the Americans agreed to was that, yes, Stalin and the Soviets could keep Eastern Poland, but that Poland, the future Poland, would be compensated, in effect, by taking territories that had been part of Germany before World War II. And what this amounted to is the joke, not really a funny joke, but you can see how it happened, was that Poland was simply shoved about 200 miles to the west on the map. Now, one thing that this did, the redrawing of the map did, was that the city of Lviv which had been Polish before World War II, would now become part of the Soviet Union, to be known as Lvov in Russian or Lviv in Ukrainian, with this part of Ukraine becoming part as well of the Soviet Union. The city of Danzig, what had been the free city of Danzig before World War II, would be part of the zone that would be given to Poland, and now Danzig would become a fully Polish city called Gdansk. Now, another thing that accompanied this was a mass campaign of, again, what we now call ethnic cleansings, carried out by the new communist governments of Eastern Europe, including the governments of the Soviet Union and the new so-called Polish People's Republic. Now, what this included was a decision by the new Poland and the USSR that Poles who had been living in the areas that before the war had been southeastern Poland. I know it's hard to keep track of this, it's complicated. But the areas that had been Polish were part of Poland, where Poles had lived, but those territories were now being given to the Soviet Union. Those Poles would be forcibly moved out of what was now Soviet Ukraine, and they would be transplanted into Poland. At the same reciprocally, Ukrainians living in Poland would now be transplanted, whether they wanted to or not, into the Soviet Union. This resulted, you can kind of take a look at the green arrows emanating from here. This meant that about 1 million Poles, ethnic Poles, were moved from what had been Polish Eastern Galicia, including the city of Lvov. They were now being moved into Poland. And where were they being moved into? Well, they were largely being moved into the territories that had been part of Germany, but now were being given to Poland because, the Germans who had lived there either had fled as refugees during the war, or they themselves had been forcibly ethnically cleansed by the new communist governments and forcibly shipped out of areas where Germans had lived for centuries and shipped into Poland. So this was the logical, if you want to call it that, speaking logic about these essentially brutal mass ethnic cleansings, many undertaken under extraordinarily violent circumstances by these new governments. Where are you going to move them? You're going to move them into these newly emptied areas. Now, it was not simply that. You also had areas down here in what was still southeastern Poland. You still had a remnant of non-ethnic Poles, peoples like the Wemkos or others who were, not quite Polish, but not quite Ukrainian either, but still perhaps closer to Ukrainian than Polish, speaking something like Ukrainian dialect, who were also forcibly transplanted by the new Polish communist authorities out of southeastern Poland. Why? Well, what you had was areas of near civil war going on down there. there was still ethnic strife between Poles and non-Poles, Ukrainians. Uh, there was also partisan activity going on in these areas. And you were having, you know, a low-level civil war going on down there between the communist officials, between the forces of the new communist government, remnants of the non-communist World War II Polish resistance, and still Ukrainian partisans in that area. So what you had was a sort of depopulation of that area of southeastern Poland, and again, um, where were these people moved? Well, they too were moved into what were now called the Western or the recovered territories, the regions that had been part of Germany. They had been primarily populated by Germans, but now they were to become part of post-World War II Poland. And this is where my story about the links between Lviv and Gdansk, between what had been that old eastern Poland and that new, the areas that had not historically been Polish but became Polish after World War II. That's where this starts to come together, because in many ways what happened were that the people and much of the culture of what had been the Poland of pre-World War II uh, was now shifted uh, to these new areas. Just to speak of people, a lot of the Poles and who had lived in eastern Poland around Lviv, uh, they were moved into areas that had been German, around the new cities of what the Poles called Wrocław or Gdańsk. It was very possible to walk around these areas and hear people speaking the sort of Polish that one associated with the old Eastern Polish. This was the case even in my wife's family, who had my wife had an uncle who had been born around Lviv. He was one of the transplants. He was transplanted into areas in Silesia that had been German before World War II. He became a coal miner there. But to the end of his days, he still spoke Polish with that sort of Eastern Lviv accent. Um, the Ossolineum Institute, one of the most venerable and leading Polish libraries, museums, archives that had been located in Lviv. Well, the Soviets retained most of it, but the part of the Ossolineum that they grudgingly agreed to allow to go to Poland, well, that was transplanted to the city that before World War II had been German and German-speaking Breslau, but now became Polish Wrocław, one of the leading cities of what was now southwestern Poland after World War II. Um, in the realm of sport, the oldest Polish soccer club was Lechia Lvov. It had been started in Lvov back in the early 20th century, back in 1903. Well, after World War II, Lechia Lvov was moved from Lvov, which was now part of Soviet Union, and it was moved to Gdańsk, what had been Danzig, and now became Polish Gdańsk, and it remains one of the leading Polish soccer teams to this day, Lechia Gdańsk. Now, um, after World War II, uh, what had remained of Polish heritage and Polish history in the city of Lviv was left to go to rack and ruin, uh, both out of neglect and out of a deliberate attempt by the Soviet Union to erase any trace of the memory that this once had been one of the proudest and most famous of Polish cities. And in particular, the Polish section of the Wyczakowski, or in Ukrainian now the Lychakiv cemetery, was allowed to go into decay, particularly the monuments to the Poles who had given their lives in defense of the Polish side in the war of 1918 and 1919. In the city, there wasn't much left of Danzig after World War II. This shows the shell of the city after it had been bombarded and demolished by the Soviet Red Army in the process of capturing the city. Almost all of the population of the German residents of Danzig had fled, or the remnants driven out after World War II. And the city was repopulated by Polish speakers and largely people from other parts of Poland and what had been uh, Polish areas of what were now the Soviet Union. And in particular, the new Gdańsk became a major shipbuilding port, among the leading shipbuilders of Europe, and it was the shipyards of the Tri-City of Gdańsk, Gdynia, and Sopot that became one of the most prominent industries of the new Poland, the new communist version of of Poland. Now, of course, I'm going to have to try to step this up. I don't want to try your patience. Communism in Poland didn't work very well. I'm not telling you something that you don't know. And not only was the regime unpopular for its dictatorship, its limitation on freedoms, civil liberties, freedoms of speech, and the like, the humiliating subjection to the Soviet Union that was perceived by all as an insult to Polish national dignity, but also the economic hardships of the communist system that led to shortages of goods, low standards of living, standing in line for small supplies of shoddy or hard to attain goods, and over the decade, it didn't take long for dissatisfaction to begin mounting, dissatisfaction that ultimately would end in the overthrow, the peaceful overthrow of communism in Poland by the end of the 1980s. Now, one of the landmarks along this was what became known as the Revolta Grudniowa, the December Revolt of 1970. And this was one of the most serious of any number of worker revolts, revolts by industrial workers uh, in grievance against their lot under communism. And this was largely focused on the Baltic Sea coast, around Gdansk and Gdynia, around the shipyards of that area. Now, what was happening? Uh, well, let's focus on the most famous of these, the Lenin shipyard, as it came to be known, of Gdansk. Now, why in particular? Why in particular did you have a swelling of unrest um, and dissatisfaction with communist policy in the Baltic Sea coast? Well, up here you had one thing to bear in mind is that in the first place, we're talking 1970. In general, the population of Poland after World War II was quite young by European standards. Why do I mention this? Well, because of the great loss of life during World War II, and the repopulation of Poland largely took place by natural increase. And so what you had was a sort of bulge in the population made up of people who had been born since 1945. This was also a generation that had no memory of World War II or of the terrible years, of the worst years of the communist dictatorship of the late 1940s and early 1950s. So unlike their elders, who were inclined to say, well, yeah, things are bad, but, they're not as bad as the war. They're not as bad as it was during early communism. These were people who did not have that sort of basis of comparison. All they knew were that things were bad and that they didn't like it. You also had masses of workers thrown together, and so they could sense each other's grievances. They could also sense that there were a lot of them and that they were important to the Polish economy. And if people didn't listen to their grievances, well, that, they needed to be paid attention to. And also, they had the impetuosity of youth. They were the fathers of young families who were feeling the pinch of living in small apartments and just scraping by. So by the time that massive increases in the price of food, government determined food prices in the communist economy were announced in December of 1970, large masses of shipyard workers in the Gdansk area decided that they had had enough, and they went on strike and took to the streets. These began as largely peaceful protests, but the communist leadership, under the leadership of Władysław Gomułka, decided to treat this as counter-revolution that would be met, if necessary, by deadly force. And that is what happened on the seacoast of the Baltic. All hell broke loose for several days in December of 1970. And clashes between strikers and elements of the police and the Polish army that resulted in bloodshed, in workers being fired at, in a number of people being killed. The official number that was given was that 45 workers were slain in the December protests, but these were numbers that were widely disbelieved as distortions, that the numbers had to be much, much higher. You see here what became famous images of enraged workers in Gdansk parading with the bodies of their slain comrades, demanding redress of their grievances. This resulted in pacification of the bloodshed and restoration of order, but ultimately the dissatisfactions of Poles, including the workers of the Baltic Sea coast, particularly those of the Lenin shipyard in Gdansk, they remembered what had happened in 1970. They remembered what had happened to them when they had gone out to protest what they considered their just demands for change and a better life. They resented what they regarded as the cover-up of what had happened in 1970. They resented what they thought of as the cover-up of the memory of their comrades who had been slain, who had given their lives in the cause of workers' rights. So, at another time of mounting dissatisfaction with economic and political conditions in Poland, what you had was the outbreak of strikes in the country in the summer of 1980, and fatefully this was galvanized in nowhere else but the Gdansk shipyard, where a popular member of the shipyard workforce, a crane operator named Anna Valentinowicz, was summarily dismissed from her post for what seemed obviously fallacious charges, politically motivated charges of incompetence. This spurred the workers of the Gdansk shipyard to go out on strike, largely to restore Anna Valentinowicz to her post, but in addition, demanding that the government give in on any number of other demands of both economic and political consequence. And the man who became the acknowledged leader of the Gdansk shipyard strike was the fellow you see here, directly in back of Anna Valentinowicz with the megaphone, and that was Lech Wałęsa, a 36-year-old electrician who had been a member of the Gdansk shipyard workforce in 1970. He had been one of the strikers of 1970. He had been blackballed, he had been dismissed from the Gdansk shipyard, but he now returned and became acknowledged by his mates, his former mates as the shipyard, as the leader of the strike. And of course, the story of what happened in the Gdansk shipyard became famous. It was the Gdansk shipyard strike that gave rise to the capitulation of the Polish communist government and its agreement to recognize, to fulfill, at least on paper, the demands of the strikers. You see here the ceremony of the signature of what came to be known as the Gdansk Accords at the end of August of 1980, with the government representative sitting next to Lech Wałęsa signing the accords. And this became the beginning of the Solidarity movement. And you see here Wałęsa being carried in triumph as the leader of the strike, victorious leader of the strike, uh, the leader of the newly certified Solidarity Union. And of course, that led to a year and a half of the legal activity of Solidarity in Poland. Um, During this time, one of the demands of the Gdansk shipyard strikers was carried out, and that was the erection, to the humiliation of the communist government, a monument to the shipyard strikers of 1970 who had been slain by the government forces. And this monument of three crosses that was erected in 1980 to mark the 10th anniversary of the December 1970 strikes, and the monument that was erected and still stands outside the gates of the Gdansk shipyard. Uh, the legal existence of Solidarity came to an end in December of 1981 when the man who had become the leader of the communist government, General Wojciech Jaruzelski, declared martial law, and with it declared Solidarity illegal, and had most of the Solidarity leadership, including Lech Wałęsa, arrested in an attempt to undo the work of Solidarity and to restore conditions in the PRL, the Polish People's Republic, Communist Poland, to something like quote unquote normal. Well, in the long run, of course, this didn't work. Martial law succeeded in the near term in driving Solidarity underground, but of course, it could not solve the long-standing underlying weaknesses and problems of communism, systemic weaknesses in Eastern Europe as a whole and in Poland in particular. And jumping forward less than a decade uh, following the original proclamation of Solidarity in 1980 and the desperate attempt to crush it by means of martial law in 1981, Solidarity reemerged as a legal organization in 1989 and won the closest thing to free and open elections that had been allowed in the communist zone of Europe since World War II. And the result of the Polish elections of 1989 was the end of the communist government in Poland and its replacement, its peaceful replacement by a newly democratic government that would become known as the Third Polish Republic. And what you see here is the celebration of the Solidarity victory in the elections of 1989, being celebrated by Tadeusz Mazowiecki on the left, who had become the first post-communist prime minister of democratic Poland, and by the leader of Solidarity, Lech Wałęsa, who had become the first elected post-communist president of democratic Poland. Now, Wałęsa went on to serve 5 years as president of Poland from 1991 until 1995. And during the 1990s, even though he remained, spent those years in Warsaw, he ultimately returned to Gdansk, his home, And Gdansk remained the at least historic and sentimental citadel of solidarity for the years that followed. And the Gdansk shipyard itself became a place of memorialization and even pilgrimage, a symbol of freedom and liberation. For instance, you see here as one example, a massive open air concert given in 2006 by David Gilmour, who had been a member of the popular rock group Pink Floyd. That was in celebration of the rise of solidarity. Um, there are non-musical tributes as well. Uh, the area around the shipyard, it's the shipyard became the shipyard itself fell onto hard times after the end of communism and went into decline and near bankruptcy. It is still in operation, but at one point, about 20,000 people worked in the shipyard. Anymore, only about 2,000 remain. Uh, but it is also the site of a relatively new museum, the European Solidarity Center, dedicated to the rise and the history of solidarity, uh, the history of communism in Poland, and you see here the museum itself. You see its proximity to the gates of the shipyard and to the Three Crosses Memorial to those who fell in 1970. Um, the history of Gdańsk, Danzig, uh, in other ways, is still in dispute in contemporary Poland. Uh, Danzig, formerly Danzig, now Gdańsk, is of course the area where, in many ways, the Second World War began. And in the early 2000s, plans were made for the creation of a museum of the Second World War that would be established in Gdańsk. Now, in its original conception, this museum was to be, the idea was that it was planned and curated by many eminent historians in Poland and outside of Poland as a museum that would memorialize the entirety of the war, not simply Poland, but World War II as a worldwide phenomenon. Well, a few years ago, before the official opening of the museum, uh, the newly established government of Poland, dominated by uh, the PIS, the Law and Justice Party, uh, took over the museum and redirected it with dissatisfaction with its original mission, complaining that the museum, in its original idea, did not emphasize Poland enough, or Polish contributions to the war effort, or Polish heroism in the war, uh, that it should be more a monument to Polish sacrifice, such as the nearby monument of Westerplatte. And when the museum was opened a few years later, it was opened according to this new governmental directed notion of what the museum uh, should reflect. And I might add that this too was curated by reputable historians, but that nevertheless the decision unilaterally at government behest uh, to redirect uh, how the story of the Second World War would be told in this museum was protested um, by many historians of Poland, both inside and outside of Poland. The story of World War II and the controversies surrounding World War II are an ongoing story elsewhere as well. And in the city formerly known as Lviv, but that became Soviet-dominated Lvov after World War II, but then reemerged as Lviv, the most prominent city of the western part of independent Ukraine after the end of the Cold War. There was at least a tentative and hopeful effort to restore the difficult relations between Poles and Ukrainians in that city and in that part of the world that had been such an unfortunate and sometimes bloody part of the 20th century. The fabled cemetery that the Poles called Wyczakowski and in Ukrainian was called Lychakiv was restored, and the Polish monuments to their fallen that had been allowed with deliberate intent to fall into disrepair and decay were refurbished as a joint effort of the Polish and the new Ukrainian governments. And in 2005, the presidents of Poland and Ukraine joined in the cemetery at a rededication of the Polish monuments to their fallen and a nearby Ukrainian monument to their patriotic fallen in this cemetery. An attempt, perhaps, to try to get a restart on one of the more fateful and difficult relationships of peoples in the eastern Poland and in the east of Europe and the territories of what had been the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth of old. And with that, we come to the end of this story of the historical interrelationship of these two cities, historic and beautiful in their own way, both historically parts of Poland and yet in many ways not parts of Poland as well, parts of the stories of Germany or Germanic culture or Hanseatic culture or of Ukrainian culture as well, but both part of the large and complicated and ever fascinating story of the lands and peoples of the regions in and around what had been Poland. I hope that many of you will get the chance to visit these two cities at some point, both rewarding and fascinating in their own ways. I hope you will have found this last hour plus of interest to you, and I look forward to meeting you again the next time. Until then, all best wishes. Bye.